All right, Bible readers, it is another amazing day in God's amazing fallen creation. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're here. Today is a summary in First Corinthians chapter 11, and wow, what a chapter. So I'm subtitling this Follow Jesus or Follow Paul. This is, in my opinion, the quintessential question of this overly religious age that's characterized by ignorance that we live in. Okay, I'm just going to let that stand. So, verse 1 starts out, Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Hey, I don't know if it was yesterday's video or the video before, I could have highlighted it here of all the times that Paul talks about following him. And this is like one of the clearest ones. This is my favorite example of him saying follow me because of the way that he ties it together with as, even as I also am of Christ. So he's not saying, hey, put me above Christ. He's saying follow Christ as I do. Like Paul's our example. And so this verse is just crystal clear on what Paul is trying to express when he talks about following him. And here's the thing that you need to note. No other apostle ever talked like this. No other apostle used the word follow in this way. So again, I want to reiterate because people get super defensive around this topic, and they're like, oh, he's lifting Paul up above Christ and he's telling us that we should follow Paul and not follow Christ and all that kind of nonsense. Well, none of that's true. So whenever you see that little word as, that's like an analogy, or there's I can't remember the correct word grammatically speaking for as, but it's a word that's he's not saying, you know, he's not saying do exactly what I do. He's saying I'm your example. So follow Christ in the way that I followed Christ. And so hopefully that makes sense. So again, ultimately, Paul is just simply our example of how, okay, the how to follow Christ is the critical thing. So in contrast, if we try to follow Jesus Christ from what we read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're going to be very spiritually and biblically confused. That's just not the example. Now, are there things that we can learn from, how Christ functioned during his earthly ministry? Yeah, absolutely. Again, I often make this clarity that I don't know if I have the books marked out. Maybe I do. But in the Bible, this is the portion that's written to us. These 13 books. The rest of the Bible is written for our learning. The majority of the Bible is written to the Jews, not for us. Not to us, I should say. So you have to know what part of the Bible is written to you and what part of the Bible is written for your learning. And so we can absolutely learn all kinds of things by reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm 100% an advocate of reading the entire Bible. I've read it 26 times myself. So make no mistake about that. I'm an advocate of the entire Bible, but you have to know what's written to you and what's written for you. Otherwise, you're going to absolutely be spiritually confused. You're going to be mixing law and grace and doctrines of devils and fair words and all that kind of nonsense. Okay, so be very careful with that. And this is why even this morning somebody called me out. Oh, you talk about dispensations all the time. This is exactly why I talk about dispensations all the time. If you don't understand dispensations, you are absolutely going to be biblically confused. And it's because you're going to be trying to apply this whole thing to your life. Well, good luck with all that. 613 Jewish laws. Don't tell me about your tithing. You don't even know what tithing is. Tithing is not 10% of your money. That's not it. I'm sorry to tell that to you, but that's not it. And this video is not about tithing, so I'm not going any further with that. But trust me, do a little Google searching and you'll discover very quickly that tithing has nothing to do with 10% of your money. All right, let's move on. So If you want more understanding of dispensations, I've got a study that's prepared for you. And it's, if you're watching my video, the link's right there. If you're just listening to this, it's dispensation.quickbiblestudy.com. So Paul begins by praising the brethren. We're transitioning a little bit here. Verse 2, now I praise you, brethren. Now pay attention to that, because later on he's going to change complete directions and say, I praise you not, in something else. Okay, so be aware of that. He says, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. Okay. Couple things. I think there's a possibility that Paul is being a little bit sarcastic here. I'm not going to get all dogmatic about that. You got to kind of read between the lines. But the reality was the church at Corinth they were baby Christians. All they could handle was meat. And Paul at one point said that all he was going to focus on was Christ and Christ crucified and the resurrection. And he was going to keep it really simple for them. But the reality is he's breaking down a number of things in this letter. So I don't know. I don't think that the Corinthians were keeping all the ordinances as Paul delivered them. Otherwise, there would be no reason for this letter, or at least the contents of this letter. Okay, so I don't know, but let's move on. And I think here's maybe the more important question for all of us, especially now in this established period of time of the dispensation of the grace of God. And that is, what ordinances did Paul deliver to them? What were these ordinances? Okay, and yes, I'm going to leave you on a cliff with that, because I'm not going there in this video. I think what I need to do is create a thorough Bible study on the ordinances of the Apostle Paul. You know what the local church does? The local church says, oh, there's two ordinances, water baptism and what they call communion, okay, which is just Jewish light for Passover. Well, that's not it, friends. That is not it. So let's move on. Verse 3. But I would have you know, okay, and here's the things that he would have you know: that the head of every man is Christ, and that the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Okay, you need to know these things. There is a lot of confusion around. There's a lot of men in Baptist churches, and I've experienced this personally. Years ago, I spent a lot of time in independent fundamental Baptist churches, and they know a lot, but they completely fail to understand rightly dividing the word of truth along dispensational lines. But what happens in these independent fundamental Baptist churches is men get real prideful and think their women should submit to them. Hey, I'm willing to admit that maybe this was just the two churches I went to, but I don't know, because I know the source of where that was coming from. And I think this is a pervasive problem within the independent fundamental Baptist churches. And you got a lot of men in that denomination that are beating their chest, thinking their woman should submit to them and blah, blah, blah. Well, here's the challenge. The head of every man is Christ. That's the first thing on the list. So listen, if you're a man listening to this and Christ, you haven't made Christ your head, okay? Don't be beating on the shoulder of your woman saying, oh, I'm your head. Make sure that Christ is your head. 1 Corinthians 11:4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, okay, keep the covered and the uncovered straight here, dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. Okay, shorn means like shaved, but if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of, pay attention, the woman, but the woman of the man. The man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. verses 8 and 9. I'm gonna get into some of these words here in a minute. Verses 8 and 9 are direct references to Genesis 2:18, which says, "And the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him." See that? But the woman for the man in 1 Corinthians 11:9, and then Genesis 2:18 says, I will make him an helpmeet for him, for the man. See that? So this is one of several verses. This next verse that I'm about to read is one of several verses in the Bible that I'm going to be looking forward to learn and understand in Bible class in heaven. I don't know about you, but I'm hoping there's Bible class in heaven. Okay, so it says, verse 10, "For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels." There is no consensus anywhere in scholarship as to what this means. So I'm not touching it. I could give you all the different, but you know what? I'm not touching it. Verse 11, "Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman." Okay, so when Paul says nevertheless, there's a reason why. So it's because, having said, it's kind of like, in fact, I just said it, right? Having said. So when somebody says, okay, well, having said all that, now I'm going to say this. So when Paul says nevertheless, he's referencing the things that he said just prior to that. And so it's kind of like, okay, in the context of what I just said, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. Whereas the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Okay, so let's get into these little words. And if you haven't figured it out, if this is the first video you've ever watched of me, then you're not aware of this. But I am a big fan of paying attention to little words in the Bible. If you can't get the little words right, you will never get the big words right. I'm going to say that again. If you do not get the little words right, you will never get the big words right. Okay? So let's start off with dollar words before we get into $10 words, like dispensation. So this thing of, so is the man also by the woman is of the man. This is a direct reference of the fact that God made Eve from Adam's rib. Eve was of the man. Does that make sense? God took a rib and made woman. So the woman is of the man. But it says, so is the man also by the woman. I think this is a direct reference to the fact that mankind, is born of a woman. Women make other men, and of course, women. Okay, so let's talk about little words. And in this case, we're gonna stick right to by and of. There's lots of little words in the Bible. Okay, these two happen to be prepositions, and they are critical to understanding Scripture. So just as an example, the word by is in the Bible 2,633 times. The word of is in the Bible 34,755 times. So don't mistake for a second that I don't need to know what those mean. 34,000 times. You better have a handle on what of means. Verse 13, judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. This is very much a cultural issue that Paul's dealing with. And I'm not really going to go into it too much, but all of this head covering and hair issue was being discussed due to the cultural norms of Paul's days. And it was obviously causing some kind of confusion. So remember when I, at the very beginning of the book of Corinthians, Paul referenced the fact that they had written him a letter. And this is partially a response to the things that they had written to him about. It's also part of his response are based upon things that he had heard about them. Like they had a certain kind of reputation. Ultimately, they were kind of like immature Christians. And so this letter is in a response to like all of that, everything that he kind of knew and understood about where this small group of people were at, spiritually speaking. And so he's addressing it. And so this head covering and hair issue and all that, it was just a cultural issue. And, Paul, almost in a conclusionary kind of way says, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. It almost has a dismissive feel to it. Verse 16 does. So, it's not that we should ignore this issue, but in today's local churches, look, the reality is you're going to see everything from women having shaved hair, cleavage hanging out, camel toe because their pants were too tight, short skirts, loose blouses. Look, I've been in churches where women bend over and it's like, whoa, there's your boobs, But then there's men with like long hair and effeminate in nature and, skinny jeaned worship leaders and, biblical ignorance and proud looks and look, everything in between. Okay. So am I going to get too wrapped around a tree about whether or not a woman wears a veil or a man has long hair? Not really. Not really. I have way more important things to deal with, such as dispensations. Because if you don't get that right, hey, I don't care if you got a veil on or not. You got to get some things right. In other words, yeah, well, I just said that. Let's move on. Verse 17. Now, in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not. Okay, so Paul starts out with, hey, I praise you for this, even if he was being sarcastic. And here he's saying, I praise you not. Well, he praises them not about what? That ye come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together in the church, I hear that there be, see, this is a reference to what I was talking about. I hear. I don't think in their letter to Paul, they wrote, hey, there's divisions in our church and there's heresies. They didn't write that. Paul heard about that. That was part of the reputation that preceded them. He says, I hear that there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. For there must be also, look, must and shall are two different words. For there must be also heresies among you, that they which are approved, 2 Timothy 2:15, right? I know some of you might understand what I'm talking about. That they which are approved may be made manifest among you. Okay, so there must be also heresies among you. So look, if you know some things and you see some things that are heresies in your church or in social media or whatever, just understand that they must be there. Otherwise, those that are approved would have there'd be no contrast. So think about this for a moment. Paul is leaving the topic of hair and veils, and he frames this next topic with there must be heresies among you. So, what is the topic? Right? This is the question that you should be asking in your mind. He sets it up. In this thing, I praise you not. There must be divisions among you. There must be heresies. Right? So what's the topic? Verse 20. When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. What? This whole thing, heresies and divisions and I praise you not, is concerning the Lord's Supper? Communion? For in eating every one taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. Can you imagine? Most Christian churches today, they're drinking grape juice. These people were apparently drinking wine and doing it to the extent that some were drunk. Let's have communion. Woo! It's a party. People on their double fist in their drinks. And like what in the world was going on? What are these people thinking? They weren't just baby Christians. They were just doing really stupid stuff. And then he opens up the next verse. What? You can almost hear his anger or disdain, like, what? Have you not houses to eat and drink in? Or despise ye the church of God and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? Hey, I finally did the research the other day. You know how many, percent, the percentage of Paul's words that he used to ask questions? It's 11%. 11% of all of Paul's recorded words were used to ask questions. And in this verse, there's 4 questions, or 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 5 questions in one verse. Paul asked a lot of 258 questions to be exact. And that equals all the words used to ask his questions are 11% of all his recorded words. And then again, he emphasizes, I praise you not. So he asks these 5 questions and he says, I praise you not. For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Do you remember that? Verse 24, and when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it in remembrance of me. So look, here's a side note. Most Christians don't know when the New Testament began. If you ask them, they'll say Matthew, or they'll say when Jesus was born, things like that. But the New Testament did not begin until the death of Jesus Christ. The New Testament is in his blood. It's no different than somebody having a last will and testament in this lifetime, and it doesn't take effect until they die. It's the same thing. Hebrews chapter 9 details that even further if you want to go look that up. Verse 26, for as often as ye eat this bread, well, what bread is he talking about? And drink this cup. See, he's not just saying, hey, as often as you eat bread and drink wine, you do show the Lord's death till he come. He doesn't say that. Again, this is why I say, until you master the small words, you're going to be confused by the big words. It's this bread and this cup. It's something very specific. It's not just any old bread. It's not little crackers. Okay? It's not, all that stuff's gone. Verse 27, wherefore, whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and of that cup. Again, what bread are we talking about? Well, I think John 6:48 begins to answer that. Jesus Christ himself said, I am that bread of life. He said that multiple times in many different contexts, that he is the bread. So when we talk about eating that bread, well, what does that mean today? Little crackers? Are you kidding me? That was a sign to the Jews. Quit playing Jew. Your church is tithing and doing Passover light. And come on, knock it off. Quit playing Jew. It's wrong. It's doctrines of devils because you're mixing old and new. Even Jesus, this has nothing to do with my notes, but even Jesus talked about when you mix old wine and in a new wine, what's the word for it? Anyway, when you mix that stuff, it causes that bladder to explode. You can't mix old and new. And people today are constantly mixing old and new. And Paul calls that doctrines of devils. It's confusion. You're going to do that to your own hurt. You're going to do that. And it's going to cause this, shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. You're doing something unworthily because you don't know what you're doing. It's like the sons of Aaron when they're like, oh, we'll go offer the incense in the holiest of holies. And God's like, No, you won't. And they were dead. And they were dead to the point where God told Aaron, don't even mourn for them. God's not messing around. Okay, he's a God of grace. No question about it. Do whatever you want, but not all things are edifying. And certainly mixing law and grace is not edifying, not to you and not to anybody that knows you. You're going to confuse your wife. You're going to confuse your children. You're going to confuse your husband. You're going to confuse your, coworkers. You're going to confuse everybody around you by mixing law and grace. And if you can't tell, I'm sick of it because it's everywhere. It's everywhere. I've already had multiple conversations about it today. It shows up constantly. Verse 29. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. Remember in John 6? So John 6:48, this is where Jesus says, I am that bread of life. And down in John 6:66, in that whole portion of that chapter, the disciples are confused. And they're basically thinking, like, is Jesus telling us to eat, to be cannibals, basically, to eat flesh and drink blood? And Jesus had to clarify for them and say, the words that I speak to you, they are spirit and they are life. We're not to be drinking grape juice and eating bread today. The communion with the Lord Jesus Christ is spiritual. That's it. And to do anything else is just you drinking unworthily and drinking damnation to yourself. The damnation is just a form of confusion. All right, verse 30. For this cause, many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. Yeah, many are weak. They don't read their Bible. They're mixing old and new doctrines. They're confused. They're spiritually sick. Okay. For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. Yeah, this is a critical truth right here. So let's get busy judging ourselves. But here's the question. What should we judge ourselves? To what should we judge ourselves? What's the judge for us? Because Paul said earlier to not be judged by any man. And here he's saying we should judge ourselves. Or he's really saying if we judge ourselves. So he's telling us we should judge ourselves. Well, to what? What's the standard? Who's the judge that we should be judged by? Well, I'm going to go all the way back up to verse 2. I've got it right here if you're looking at the video, where Paul says, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I deliver them to you. Well, how are you going to know anything about what Paul is doing and what Paul's ordinances are unless you're reading the book? You got to read the book. So we should judge ourselves according to the ordinances as Paul delivered them to us. It's that simple. Pretty simple. The execution is what's difficult. Actually learning what these things are and then actually doing that in the face of a very confused, mixed doctrine, religious environment that we live in. Verse 32. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. Wherefore, my brethren, when ye come together to eat, tarry one for another. And if any man hunger, see what's interesting here is Paul changes his language. I didn't put this in the notes. He says, if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that you come not together in a condemnation. And then up here in verse 33, when you come together to eat, he doesn't use the word communion or Passover. There's more going on here than meets the eye. Had to do with status and how some people had money and others were poor and struggling to have food. And here's these, wealthier people just eating food in front of poor people. And it was a train wreck. And if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that ye come not together unto condemnation. And look at how Paul ends this chapter. And the rest will I set in order when I come. So Paul had more to say on this issue, and so do I, frankly. And so I've got a study that you can go look at if you're interested in this question of communion. Here's the link. It's communion.quickbiblestudy.com. And I think that it will shock you about where religion has brought this whole communion nonsense. So, all right, that's what I got for you. I hope that this is helpful to you. I hope that it's inspired you to get into the Word of God and study these things out. Be a Berean. Okay, the Bereans were known for studying the scriptures in relation to what Paul was saying to determine if those things were so. And I encourage you to do the same thing. If you've never read the entire Bible, it's time to do so. It's time to pull up your big boy panties or your big girl panties and get it done. All right. Hope you have a great Bible reading. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you.